Ethan Hayes had seen a lot of weird things in space. He had spent the last 6 years working as a diplomatic liaison between humanity and various alien species, smoothing over cultural misunderstandings, handling first contact protocols, and occasionally apologizing for things humans had done that seemed normal to them but were, apparently, terrifying to the rest of the galaxy. But nothing had prepared him for the moment the S. Varus crew discovered his cat. The S. Varus were a highly advanced, highly logical species that valued order, efficiency, and absolute control over their environment. They were tall, silver-skinned beings with elongated limbs and large, reflective black eyes. They could calculate complex astrophysical equations in seconds. They could manipulate gravity with precision. But when faced with the 12-pound ball of fur, they completely lost their composure. Ethan had been aboard the S. Varus research vessel Ilvarus for nearly a month. The mission was a standard diplomatic exchange. He was there to observe their culture, offer insights into human behavior, and ensure that both sides maintained a positive relationship. He had been briefed extensively on their customs, their strict aversion to unnecessary risks, and their rigid approach to new experiences. So naturally, he had smuggled his cat onto the ship. It wasn't that he had meant to break protocol, but Jonesy, his short-haired tabby, had been with him for years. He had survived planetary quarantines, long-haul spaceflights, and one particularly disastrous encounter with an overenthusiastic customs officer on Mars. Ethan wasn't about to leave him behind, just because the S. Varus had an issue with unpredictability. For 3 weeks, things had gone smoothly. Ethan kept Jonesy confined to his quarters, feeding him in secret, making sure there was no trace of fur left behind. He even adjusted the room's environmental filters to remove any scent markers. As far as he could tell, the S. Varus had no idea Jonesy existed. That illusion shattered spectacularly on day 23. Ethan had just returned from a diplomatic briefing when his door slid open, and he saw them Scylla, the ship's chief scientist, and Yixer, the head of security, standing frozen in place, staring in absolute horror at the creature sitting on his bed. Jonesy, to his credit, didn't seem to care. He stretched, let out a massive yawn, and lazily flicked his tail. Scylla was the first to react. She took a full step back, her hands twitching as if she was resisting the urge to activate some kind of emergency protocol. Her large black eyes locked onto Ethan. "What is that monster?" Ethan blinked. "That's my cat." Yixor made a low, clicking noise that Ethan had come to associate with extreme distress. His posture had shifted into something defensive, one hand hovering near the control panel on his wrist. The S. Varus rarely needed weapons, but Ethan had the distinct impression that Yixor was seriously considering using one. Ethan sighed and stepped between them and Jonesy. "Okay, hold on. Before you do anything drastic, let's talk about this." Scylla's voice was sharp. "You have brought an unregistered biological entity aboard A.S. Varus research vessel." Ethan winced. "When you put it like that, it sounds bad." "It is bad," Yixor snapped. "It has fangs, claws. It is predatory." Ethan turned to look at Jonesy, who was now licking his paw and completely ignoring the rising tension in the room. "I mean, technically yes, but he's not dangerous." Scylla pointed at Jonesy. "It is preparing to attack." Ethan glanced at the cat, who was currently rolling onto his back, stretching in that slow, lazy way that made it absolutely clear he had no intention of moving anytime soon. "No, he's preparing to nap." Yixor's mandibles flared slightly. Its eyes glow in dim lighting. "Yeah, that's just how cats are." Scylla's fingers twitched. "We must contain it." Ethan stiffened. Hold on. Nobody is containing Jonesy." Scylla took another step back, still watching the cat like it might spontaneously grow extra limbs and launch itself at her. "It cannot be allowed to roam freely." "It doesn't roam," Ethan said. "He stays in my quarters, he eats dry food, he sleeps 20 hours a day." "Then how did it escape?" Ethan hesitated. Jonesy, as it turned out, had figured out the door controls 2 days ago. Ethan had underestimated his intelligence. The cat hadn't wandered far, just a few feet into the hallway, before deciding it wasn't worth the effort, but apparently, that had been enough. Yixor's hand remained on his wrist panel. It must be removed. Ethan folded his arms. Absolutely not. Scylla exhaled sharply. We do not know its biological impact on our systems. It could carry pathogens. Ethan shook his head. Jonesy has been through more quarantine screenings than I have. He's not a biohazard. Yixor's voice remained tense. You cannot guarantee that. Ethan sighed, stepping closer to Jonesy and scooping him up. The cat let out a small grumble but otherwise didn't resist, going limp in his arms like a furry sack of indifference. Scylla flinched. You are handling it. Ethan rolled his eyes. Yes, because he's a pet. Scylla still looked skeptical, but she wasn't outright panicking anymore. Yixor, however, was still tense. Ethan softened his tone. Look, I get it. He's unfamiliar. He has claws. He moves unpredictably. But he's harmless. I'll make sure he stays in my room from now on. Scylla's expression was difficult to read, but after a long pause, she nodded slowly. If it displays any hostility. I take full responsibility. Yixor's mandibles twitched again. We will be monitoring the situation. Ethan sighed. Of course you will. Scylla and Yixor exchanged another glance before finally, reluctantly stepping away. The door slid shut behind them, leaving Ethan alone with Jonesy. Ethan let out a breath. Well, buddy, that could have gone worse. Jonesy yawned and rubbed his face against Ethan's shoulder. Ethan sighed. They think you're a monster. Jonesy purred. Ethan shook his head. This is going to be a long trip. Ethan knew the Scifistories weren't going to let this go. Jonesy had barely done anything, but to them, he was a walking security risk. For the next several days, Ethan could feel the scrutiny intensify. He wasn't under house arrest exactly, but every time he stepped out of his quarters, he caught the lingering stares of passing crew members. Conversations stopped when he entered the room. Meetings felt more tense than usual. Even the ship's automated systems seemed to take a fraction of a second longer to respond to his commands, as if the Ilvaris itself was debating whether it should be cooperating with someone who harbored an unpredictable life form. Jonesy, as always, remained utterly unconcerned. Ethan had triple-checked his door locks to make sure there were no more surprise escape attempts, but even so, Jonesy spent an increasing amount of time watching the door, his tail flicking in that thoughtful, calculating way that suggested he was already working on his next jailbreak. Ethan groaned, running a hand through his hair. I swear, if you get out again, they're going to throw me out of the airlock. Jonesy licked his paw. Ethan sighed. Yeah, you're not worried. The real trouble started when the Scifistories decided they needed further observation. It began with Scylla. Ethan had just sat down to eat when she appeared at his table in the mess hall, her tall, silver-skinned form moving with that eerily smooth grace that the Scifistories were known for. She folded her hands behind her back, studying him with those deep black eyes that reflected too much light. Ethan swallowed a bite of something that almost tasted like chicken. Can I help you? Scylla tilted her head slightly. I require access to your quarters. Ethan tensed. Why? I must observe the entity in its natural state. Ethan nearly choked. You mean Jonesy? Scylla blinked once. The creature. Ethan groaned. You can just say cat, you know. Scylla didn't respond to that. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Look, Scylla, I appreciate that you're trying to understand, but I really don't think Jonesy wants to be observed. Scylla remained impassive. I assure you my presence will be non-disruptive. Ethan highly doubted that. But he also knew that if he refused, they'd just come up with some new excuse to monitor Jonesy remotely. At least this way, he could control the situation. He exhaled. Fine, but no touching, no sudden movements, and no containment fields. Scylla inclined her head. Acceptable. 10 minutes later, Ethan let her into his quarters. Jonesy was already watching from the bed, his green eyes half-lidded in that unreadable way that made Ethan suspect he understood far more than he let on. His tail flicked once. Scylla hesitated at the threshold. Ethan arched an eyebrow. "You all right?" She did not move. Ethan followed her gaze. She was staring at Jonesy, her fingers twitching slightly. After a long pause, she spoke. "It is. Staring at me." Ethan blinked. "Yeah, he does that." Scylla's posture remained stiff. "Why?" Ethan scratched the back of his head. "I don't know. Because he feels like it." Scylla frowned. "That is not a sufficient explanation." Ethan sighed. "That's kind of the thing about cats. They do things for their own reasons." Scylla did not look comforted by that. Slowly, carefully, she stepped inside. Jonesy did not react, he simply continued watching her, his pupils narrowing slightly. Ethan gestured toward the chair by the desk. "You can sit if you want." Scylla remained standing. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the ship's life support systems. Jonesy hadn't moved. His tail flicked again. Scylla exhaled. "It is assessing me." Ethan rubbed his face. "He's curious. That's all." Scylla didn't look convinced. She tapped something on her wrist device. A small floating drone activated near her shoulder, recording everything. Jonesy's ears twitched. Ethan stiffened. You might not want to." Jonesy moved. One moment, he was on the bed. The next, he had leapt onto the desk in a blur of fur and claws, swatting the drone out of the air with pinpoint accuracy. It crashed to the floor with a sharp crack. Scylla took a rapid step back. Ethan groaned. "Jonesy, you can't just attack their tech." Jonesy sat proudly next to the broken drone, tail curled around his paws, eyes bright with triumph. Scylla's breathing had quickened. "It hunts." Ethan threw up his hands. "It doesn't hunt. He just hates small flying things." Scylla's gaze flicked to the broken drone. "That was a precision strike." Ethan sighed. "Yeah, he's got good aim." Scylla did not look reassured. She tapped something on her wrist, and a new data display appeared. The reaction time was significantly faster than anticipated. Ethan rubbed his temples. "I don't know what to tell you. He's a cat. He does what he wants." Scylla's gaze flickered back to Jonesy. He was now grooming himself, utterly uninterested in the conversation. Finally, she exhaled and turned back to Ethan. "This will require further study." Ethan groaned. "Of course it will." Over the next few days, the S-Varus observation efforts increased. Jonesy had become a subject of shipwide curiosity, and to Ethan's immense frustration, a security risk. Yixor had doubled the patrols near Ethan's quarters, and Scylla had submitted no fewer than 5 separate reports detailing Jonesy's unpredictable nature. Ethan knew this wasn't sustainable. So naturally, Jonesy made the decision for him. It happened during a routine system check. Ethan had been in the engineering bay, discussing human interface design, when the ship's emergency lights flashed red. Yixor's voice boomed through the intercom. "Containment breach detected." Ethan's stomach plummeted. He bolted down the corridor. He already knew. By the time he reached his quarters, half the security team was there, weapons drawn, staring at the open door. Ethan's heart pounded. Where is he? Scylla turned to him, her expression tight. It escaped. Ethan swore. The security cameras had picked up movement. Jonesy had somehow, impossibly figured out the emergency override controls. He was now somewhere in the ventilation system. Ethan groaned. You have got to be kidding me. Scylla's voice was firm. We must locate it immediately. Ethan rubbed his face. I told you to stop stressing him out. Yixor's mandibles clicked. This is your doing, human. Ethan scowled. Then let me fix it. Without waiting for permission, he grabbed a flashlight and climbed into the nearest vent. He found Jonesy 20 minutes later, curled up on top of one of the ship's heating units. Ethan sighed in relief, reaching out. All right, buddy. Enough adventure for today? Jonesy stretched, yawned, and let Ethan pick him up. Ethan crawled back through the vents, finally dropping down into the hallway. The assembled S. Varus watched in stunned silence as he held Jonesy up. Ethan smirked. See? Crisis averted. Silas stared at Jonesy, then at Ethan. Finally, she exhaled. This is becoming normal. Ethan chuckled. Give it time. The S. Varus had seen wars. They had charted black holes, tamed the chaotic forces of gravity, and engineered vessels that could withstand the crushing depths of neutron stars. But none of that had prepared them for the ongoing psychological warfare of living with a cat. The crisis of Jonesy's grand escape had, much to Ethan's surprise, not resulted in immediate exile. Instead, it had sparked an entirely new phase of S. Varus behavior one Ethan could only describe as a kind of forced acclimation. They were trying to accept him. Badly. Ethan first noticed it when he woke up to find a small, unfamiliar device mounted in the corner of his room. It emitted a faint pulsing light, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. He sighed and rolled out of bed. All right, which one of you installed the cat spy? The intercom clicked. Sila's voice came through, sounding much too casual. Observation device. Ethan groaned, running a hand through his hair. Sila. It is entirely non-intrusive, she insisted. Except for the part where it's in my room. There was a brief pause. We must understand its behaviors. Ethan rubbed his face. He's a cat. He eats, he sleeps, and he occasionally knocks things off tables. That's it. Sila remained silent. Ethan sighed, walking over to Jonesy's food bowl. Let me guess. You're watching this right now. The intercom didn't answer, which was all the confirmation Ethan needed. He rolled his eyes, grabbed a ration pack, and poured some of the nutrient-dense kibble into the bowl. Jonesy hopped off the bed and sauntered over, sniffing the food with the slow, judgmental precision of a critic evaluating fine art. Ethan crossed his arms. See? Completely normal. There was another pause. Then, cautiously, Sila asked, why does it hesitate before consuming? Ethan blinked. What? The nutritional substance has been provided. It should begin the ingestion process immediately. Ethan stared at the intercom, then at Jonesy, who had now decided he wasn't interested in the food after all, and was licking his paw instead. Ethan sighed. Yeah, welcome to owning a cat. It didn't stop there. Yixor, the hard-nosed head of security, who had previously regarded Jonesy as a security risk at best and an outright existential threat at worst, had begun what Ethan could only describe as controlled exposure therapy. One evening, while reviewing mission logs in the mess hall, Ethan caught movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned just in time to see Yixor standing at the far end of the room, his posture stiff, his eyes locked onto Jonesy, who was curled up on Ethan's lap. Yixor did not move closer. He did not speak. He just stood there. Ethan frowned. You okay, Yixor? Yixor's mandibles twitched. I am. Acclimating. Ethan blinked. Acclimating. I must ensure I do not react with hostility in case of further interactions. Ethan bit back a laugh. You're desensitizing yourself. Yixor's gaze remained fixed on Jonesy. His posture was rigid. I will not be bested by a terrestrial entity. Jonesy stretched, flicked an ear, and went back to sleep. Ethan smirked. Yeah, good luck with that. The breakthrough, however, came in the form of an unexpected cultural exchange. A week after Jonesy's escape attempt, Sila requested a formal meeting. Ethan expected another argument over containment protocols, but when he arrived at the research lab, she was standing next to a small holographic display, looking thoughtful. She gestured for him to sit. Ethan sat. Jonesy, who he had reluctantly brought along at Sila's insistence, hopped onto the table and immediately began sniffing the equipment. Sila did not flinch. That was progress. She tapped the control panel, and the hologram shifted, displaying a small, six-legged creature with shimmering scales and wide, luminous eyes. Ethan frowned. What am I looking at? Sila's voice was measured. This is the Aerolisk, a species native to the pre-industrial era of S. Verus Prime. Ethan tilted his head. All right, what about them? Sila hesitated. They were companions. Ethan blinked. Wait, you had pets? Sila's expression shifted slightly. Not pets, co-inhabitants. They assisted in pest control and provided companionship. Their presence was considered beneficial. Ethan stared at her. And you're telling me this now? Sila exhaled. The Aerolisk were rendered extinct due to environmental shifts. They have not been part of our culture for centuries. Ethan glanced down at Jonesy, who was now batting at a stray cable on the table. So you do understand the concept of domesticated animals. Sila hesitated. In theory. Ethan smirked. And let me guess, you're realizing Jonesy isn't all that different. Sila did not answer immediately. Then, slowly, she said, there are similarities. Ethan leaned back. See? That wasn't so hard, was it? Sila glanced at Jonesy, who had begun purring as he curled into a loaf shape on the table. Her fingers twitched slightly. Ethan arched an eyebrow. You want to pet him, don't you? Sila stiffened. Ethan grinned. Come on, just one little pet. For science. Sila hesitated. Then, very slowly, she reached out a cautious hand. Jonesy flicked his tail but did not move away. Sila's fingers barely brushed his fur before she pulled back, her posture stiff. Ethan chuckled. Well. Sila looked at her hand as if expecting something profound to have changed. Then she exhaled. It is, softer than anticipated. Ethan laughed. Yeah, that tends to be the reaction. Yixor, who had been silently observing from the doorway, crossed his arms. If the chief scientist has interacted with the entity, it is only logical for security to do so as well. Ethan smirked. Oh, this I gotta see. Yixor stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Slowly, cautiously, he extended one hand. Jonesy sniffed it once, then immediately rubbed his face against it, marking him as property. Yixor froze. Ethan burst out laughing. Congratulations. You've been claimed. Yixor's mandibles twitched. It has altered my scent markers. Ethan grinned. Yeah, that means he likes you. Yixor's posture remained stiff. This is acceptable. Sila watched the interaction for a long moment. Then she exhaled, turning back to her data pad. We will update the official records. Ethan leaned back. And what, exactly, will they say? Sila glanced at Jonesy. Then, very carefully, she said, the terrestrial entity is a non-threatening presence. Ethan laughed. See? We're making progress. Jonesy purred. Ethan never thought he'd see the day when an entire crew of highly advanced, hyperlogical aliens would be holding a formal meeting about how to properly cohabitate with a cat. But here he was, seated in the main conference room of the Ilvaris, surrounded by some of the highest-ranking S. Verus officers on the ship, watching as Sila pulled up a diplomatic report, titled Coexistence with Terrestrial Entity Challenges and Adaptations. Across the table, Yixor sat with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, while a few other S. Verus researchers studied data screens with the same level of intensity they usually reserved for black hole trajectory calculations. Ethan rubbed his temples. You really don't have to make this an official thing. Sila tapped the control panel. Incorrect. It is now a ship-wide matter. Ethan groaned. He's just a cat. Sila turned toward him, expression calm. The crew has demonstrated an increased level of interaction with the entity. This necessitates a standardized approach. Ethan blinked. Wait, hold on. Interaction. Yixor exhaled. The entity moves unpredictably. It has become increasingly present in daily ship functions. Ethan frowned. What do you mean present? Scylla pressed another button. A screen lit up, showing security footage from various parts of the ship. The first clip was from the engineering bay. Jonesy was sitting atop a control console, his tail flicking as an exasperated S-Varus technician hesitated to move him. The second clip showed him curled up on a supply crate in the cargo hold, napping peacefully while two S-Varus crew members whispered in the background, clearly unsure if they were allowed to disturb him. The third was from the bridge itself. Jonesy had somehow made his way onto the captain's chair, where he was loafed comfortably while the actual captain, a high-ranking S-Varus named Varus, stood nearby, looking visibly conflicted. Ethan stared, then burst out laughing. Yixor's mandibles twitched. This is not humorous. Ethan wiped a tear from his eye. You're telling me you've gone from trying to throw him off the ship to letting him sit in the captain's chair? Scylla folded her arms. The crew has adapted. Ethan grinned. No, you've been defeated. Yixor scowled. It is more efficient to allow the entity to remain where it chooses. Ethan smirked. Translation: you tried to move him, and it didn't work. Scylla did not deny it. Ethan leaned back, crossing his arms. All right, so what's this meeting really about? Scylla hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, as if reluctant to admit it, she said, we require further clarification on its behaviors. Ethan blinked. Clarification. Yixor pulled up another screen. It has continued its aggressive actions towards surveillance equipment. The footage showed Jonesy perched on top of a high shelf, eyes locked onto a hovering observation drone. After a moment of perfect stillness, he pounced, knocking it clean out of the air. Ethan exhaled. Right. Yeah, you're never getting that drone program back. Scylla's fingers twitched. We must understand its motives. Ethan stared at her. Scylla. He's not hunting them. Scylla tilted her head. Then why does it persist? Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. Because it's fun. The S-Varus looked at him blankly. Ethan groaned. You don't have games, do you? Scylla hesitated. We engage in structured mental exercises. Right. That's not the same thing. Ethan gestured toward the screen. Jonesy swats drones because it's fun. No strategy, no survival instinct. Just pure entertainment. Yixor frowned. It derives enjoyment from disrupting automated processes. Ethan grinned. Yeah, welcome to cats. Scylla looked genuinely disturbed. This is highly inefficient. Ethan shrugged. Not everything has to be efficient. There was a long pause as the S-Varus digested that horrifying idea. Finally, Scylla exhaled. There is another matter. She pulled up a heat map of the ship. Ethan frowned. What am I looking at? Scylla pointed to a concentrated cluster of warm zones. These are the most frequently occupied areas of the vessel. Ethan squinted. Are you tracking where Jonesy sleeps? Scylla nodded. It has demonstrated a preference for warm, enclosed spaces. Ethan fought back a laugh. Yeah, that's what cats do. Yixor folded his arms. This has led to complications. Ethan arched an eyebrow. What kind of complications? Scylla tapped the screen again. More security footage appeared this time, showing a tense standoff in the maintenance sector. Jonesy was curled up on a critical power conduit, sleeping soundly. 3 S-Varus engineers stood in the doorway, completely unwilling to approach. Ethan nearly choked. You're telling me your highly advanced species who have mastered gravity manipulation refuse to move a sleeping cat? Yixor's mandibles twitched. It displayed signs of irritation when disturbed. Ethan smirked. You mean he flicked his tail? Scylla nodded gravely. Ethan burst out laughing. Yixor scowled. It was unclear if the hostility would escalate. Ethan wiped a tear from his eye. You were afraid to wake him up. Scylla didn't answer. Ethan grinned. Congratulations, you've been domesticated. Over the next several days, the transition from fear to acceptance became even more apparent. One evening, Ethan walked into the mess hall to find two Veris crew members sitting awkwardly still while Jonesy lay sprawled across the table between them, napping. Neither of them moved, clearly unwilling to disturb him. In the engineering bay, one of the maintenance staff had built a small ledge near the heat vents, an unofficial designated sleeping area that, according to rumor, had been approved by the captain. Even Yixor, the ever-stern head of security, had stopped reacting whenever Jonesy brushed past his legs in the corridors. Ethan had even caught him sneaking a small piece of protein ration to the cat when he thought no one was looking. Ethan smirked. The Ilverus had been conquered. A week later, as Ethan was reviewing mission logs in his quarters, the intercom clicked on. Sila's voice came through, neutral as ever. The crew has reached a consensus. Ethan arched an eyebrow. Oh. There was a pause. Then, as if it physically pained her to say it, Sila admitted. The entity may remain indefinitely. Ethan grinned. You like him? Sila exhaled sharply. It is a tolerable presence. Ethan chuckled. You could just say yes. There was no response. Jonesy yawned, stretched, and hopped onto Ethan's lap, curling up contentedly. Ethan smirked. Looks like you're a permanent crew member now, buddy. Jonesy purred. And with that, the greatest diplomatic mission of Ethan's career was complete.